And you are live.
Welcome to the Income-Based Education Tax Study Committee. Today is Wednesday, October 26th. It's 10 a.m. We're going to spend the next 6 hours together talking about income-based education taxes and trying to find a way through some administrative challenges with figuring this out and some sort of perspectives on equity and who should pay in figuring this out. And so today we're going to start the morning with some context of both the general fund and the education fund to have a sense of sort of where they're going and where we might see opportunities and challenges ahead. And then in the afternoon, we're going to dive into some modeling to talk about who might pay in the future under various scenarios. Any thoughts, questions, announcements before we jump in? Okay. We have our parking lot from last week, 2 weeks ago, of just sort of outstanding items to consider and thinking about that I'm holding with me as we work, and we can revisit them as we go. Sarah, sorry for the false alarm.
Good morning.
Morning.
I'm Sarah Clark. I'm the Deputy Fiscal Officer with the Joint Fiscal Office, and I'm here with you today to talk a little bit about the general fund, projecting both revenue and appropriations into the future and some of the budget pressures facing the general fund in the near term.
And the reason we're sort of talking about this, even though it might seem at the surface a little off the path of the education fund, is it's all the same Vermonters' money. And we can't find out tomorrow how much money is sort of in the state writ large, though I am curious about that. And so we're just sort of making sure that we understand what's happening in other funds as the education fund might affect that.
So to give you some context, and I think everyone has either a paper copy of the presentation or you have it available online. So I'm going to go to the second slide in the presentation, which is the kind of graphical depiction of the gap analysis, which is the difference between revenue, both historical and projecting into the future, and base appropriations. In the past, this was, I think, affectionately referred to as the alligator chart. And so we'll talk a little bit about, as you look into the out years, you look at the difference in the widening of the mouth in the graph in front of you. So just to kind of set the stage for what you're looking at, the blue line reflects revenues. The green line reflects either actual expenditures or projected appropriations into the future. The information has been updated through the July emergency board meeting, so the revenues are going to reflect the economist's consensus forecast. And largely it reflects the same assumptions that we used during the last session. And one of the reasons for that is because it's still a little bit early in the budget building process, and we'll be kind of fine tuning this analysis as we come into the session and learning more about the pressures facing the general fund.
Sarah, does this reflect the tax credits that we did?
Yes, it does.
It does.
It does, yes. Those were all incorporated into the revenue, the consensus process in July. So yes.
Okay.
It also reflects the pension agreement.
It does. It does. Yep.
Reflects all the things we decided last session.
Yes. But it's good. And then, as we look to the future, though, that's where having the conversations about what the future projections reflect and what should they reflect. Right now, this analysis looking into 25, 26, and 27 for spending, we're assuming a 3.5% growth rate from year to year from a spending perspective, which I think we could have lots of discussion about what that should really look like. We used 3.5% last year, which at the time seemed very reasonable. Right now, with inflationary pressures that we're facing, that's probably a conversation we're going to need to have more of when we head into the session.
It also reflects, though, sort of the existing tax structure and assumptions around folks' income.
Correct. So you can see when you look at state on the left side of the graph, state fiscal year 16 to 22, really, you'll see where the revenue and the expenses are very close because that's reflecting actual expenditures. When you move through 21, 22, and 23, you'll see where the revenue and expenses, kind of the gap between them grows bigger. And that's really unprecedented with the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw a continued influx of revenue that the state of Vermont was able to use to make some one-time investments. Working in collaboration with the governor, the legislature made several key investments, including in pensions and many other areas. When you look, and we're going to blow this chart out on the next page so you can see the difference as we look to the future, 24, 25, 26, and 27, you're going to see where the green line, the projected spending, is higher than the blue line, the revenue. And so that's, where we're always kind of preparing and having conversations about how do we cover that gap, because we do typically face that in any given year.
Just so I'm clear, the numbers are actually, the top number is the blue line for some reason, right?
Correct.
Okay. Sort of confusing.
Yeah, correct. And then it does, but you're right, it does flip. So can make that more clear maybe with coloring the numbers. So, but the important is really just to see, where it comes together. And then during the pandemic, the revenues were really outpacing our spending, which provided a unique opportunity for investments. And then as we look to the future, spending is projected to be higher than revenue. So if you flip to the next page, it really blows out just that state fiscal year 21 to 27. It also, I need to point out, the scale of the axis is not set to 0. So that really magnifies the differences. So it kind of overstates it, but I think it helps to depict the differences. And so you'll see, as we talked about, during the pandemic years, the difference between revenues and appropriations, which allowed for one-time funds that we were able to invest. And we're currently looking at about $260 million of one-time general fund that will be available as we go through the budget adjustment and budget process in the next legislative session. It's pretty similar to what we faced last year that allowed the legislature to make some investments in some key areas. And then, as we discussed on the previous slide, you just see the difference between appropriations and revenue in the out years, and that we're projecting there to be a gap, which will be a shortfall that we have to develop a plan to cover.
I think when I've heard this described as an alligator chart before, I sort of imagined that it just stayed open and got wider and wider, but that's not actually what this looks like to me. It looks like actually the gap narrows. I mean, and obviously spending is not going to be that and revenue is not going to be that. And so it's all a little imaginary, but the lines do seem to come back together.
They do come back together, and that's quite a bit into the future.
Yes.
And the reality is we do always close the mouth.
Yes.
Right? Like we have to close the mouth somehow. If you were to look at this slide from last year, the general fund revenue growth rates were actually much lower than what the July forecast is predicting. And so the mouth was very close together, the upper and lower lip. And so, it really depends on the consensus forecast projections.
And so if we had, they're of course close together in past years because we closed them in past years. If someone had done this same chart 10 years ago about the 10 years that just passed, would we see the exact?
Yes, I would expect that we would see the exact same things. I think this chart has probably been produced for at least 10 years prior to my time, but I know it's been talked about. And typically how we kind of set the stage as we head into a budgeting season,
And it always looks like an alligator.
I assume that's why there's a picture of an alligator on the wall in the
Yes.
appropriations room.
Okay.
Oh,
Chris.
A real alligator.
I'm curious, the baseline approach here does climb in the next couple of years. And is that sort of surprises me because my understanding of our budget was more one-time investments. And so is there a couple of big ticket items there that account for that? And then why then the trend softens? So can you just help me understand that?
Yeah, and well, actually, if some of the next slides talk a little bit about it. And I will say that, we're making some assumptions for the FY24 budget, which is the next big round of budgeting, in terms of what are the spending pressures. And we're going to talk a little bit high level what those spending pressures are. And then, so that's kind of the big leap to 24. And then it's 3.5% thereafter. So that's probably more moderated.
Okay.
But I expect it is still early in the budgeting cycle. The administration, I think, just recently received from all the agencies and departments their responses to the budget instructions, which was a 3% general fund growth, and how they would live within that. And so I expect that we'll obviously learn much more come January, but over the coming weeks and months.
Andy?
That 260 million, is that all like general fund, or does that include like federal grants, ARPA money, things like that?
It's all general fund. So, and it's split between how we ended the year in state fiscal year 22 and surplus that was on the bottom line, and then also projections for 23, the year that we're in now, where revenue is exceeding appropriations.
When is the next employee contract due to be settled?
So I think they just settled last spring for a 2-year contract where they negotiated in the first year a 4.9% average increase across both the cost of living and steps for state employees. That was the first year of the contract. And the second year of the contract was 3.9% combined, which, for a state employee perspective, that's very significant compared to historical. But when you compare it to the market and rates that are really needing to be provided increases to many different sectors to retain employees, it's in line with what we're seeing.
Yeah.
In other areas.
Inflation is at 8 point something.
Yeah, right.
I went to the grocery store yesterday. I'm still in shock.
So the next slide gives a little bit more context about the general fund and some of the spending pressures that it faces. The powerful things about the general fund is that it's very flexible in terms of how you can use it. But there are significant pressures of base spending on the general fund. So even though it's very fungible, there are a lot of needs and demands on general fund. In addition, it's important to understand that general fund across many agencies and departments is it allows us to leverage federal funds. It serves as the match on federal funds. And so we're actually able to maximize our investment by leveraging federal dollars. But a lot of times a general fund dollar is not free and clear because it's leveraging a federal dollar somewhere else. And so you have to be careful when you contemplate reductions because there may be a magnifying impact by reducing a general fund dollar, because then you won't be able to leverage that federal dollar. So the FY23 general fund base appropriations was roughly $1.9 billion. Of that $1.9 billion, though all of these items listed below are, discretionary is not the right word, but choices can be made about these items.
That should be a B at the end of the 1.9.
Well,
And everything else is an
a-
M.
It's a common.
It's a common.
Yeah, so it's one,
Okay.
yes,
it's 1,000.
it's correct here, but I just shorthanded it to 1.9 billion.
Okay.
So these are the bottom line here is that 72% of general fund dollars are committed to these programs above. So Medicaid and Global Commitment is what we refer to in Vermont. That's $608 million. That funds healthcare, a variety of programs at AHS, from developmental services to mental health services and supports, substance use treatment, all those types of things. And this is leveraging a lot of federal dollars, this $608 million of general fund. It leverages roughly on average for every dollar of Medicaid reflects roughly 45-cent state dollars and 55-cent federal dollars. So you maximize your expenditure. The Department of Corrections is really largely a general fund funded department. That's $164 million in the FY23 budget. And, they fund many things, correctional facilities, a lot of operations behind that. So there's typically that's not a lot of flexibility in terms of general fund dollars. When you look across all of the other AHS programs, it's everything from family services to children in custody, to childcare financial assistance programs, to programs at the Vermont Department of Health, which is also a department that leverages a lot of federal dollars or general fund.
Where does Are designated agencies in there?
Yes,
So
exactly.
that's for the mental health.
Exactly. Developmental services, that's all the designated agency system. Then, of course, you have to fund your teacher's retirement and your other post-employment benefits, OPEB. Liabilities is another significant use of general fund dollars. And then debt service is a mandatory thing that you need to cover with your general fund dollars.
I thought OPEB, that's state employees, teachers are in the ed fund.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's 72% of the general fund. So it doesn't leave a lot for the rest of state government, right? And you wouldn't consider natural resources or agriculture, ACCD, all of the kind of general government services, like that all needs to be funded, with some mix of the general fund dollars that remain. So even when revenues are increasing in the general fund, it can still make for very challenging budgeting times when you look at the needs, the demands on the general fund. So the next slide talks at a high level about some typical spending pressures that face Vermont when we build our general fund budget. So as I said earlier, it's still early in the FY24 budget development process. The administration is compiling the budget for the governor. As I said, they issued instructions to all agencies and departments to live within a 3% growth for the general fund. So while I'll tell you that's probably most generous that I've seen in my almost 20 years building budgets in state government. It was typically a level fund budget, meaning you have to assume the same amount of general fund revenues. 3% is a big increase, but when you're talking about, we know that state employees got 4.9% increase, you can see like just the beginning of how it's still challenging to fit within that 3%. So we will get there, but there's choices that come with getting there. And so in any given year, you have to address the increased costs of state operations, including inflationary pressures, which I can only assume that we're going to see quite a bit of that across state government, the many agencies and departments. We've already talked quite a bit about workforce pressures and having to annualize the salary increases for state employees. You're also going to see a variety of cost pressures across programs that have caseloads that could be increasing and other kind of program pressures. So this could include things like higher education in Vermont and some of the commitments that we've made to higher education, the costs of our court system and reopening the courts in this kind of post-pandemic world, as well as the Agency of Human Services. A lot of their cost is driven by caseloads. And as you've probably heard and seen, their caseloads are increasing in a variety of areas. The other, I think, really big pressure that's going to be a conversation in this upcoming session has to do around housing. Both, I think, the continued build out of affordable housing and housing in general, as well as addressing the housing needs of our most vulnerable Vermonters. And so I expect that that will be part of this proposal that will come to the legislature. In addition, another conversation that happens every year is on rate adjustments. And Senator Cummings, you talked a little bit about the designated agency system. And so last year they did receive an 8% increase in the budget, but rate adjustments is a continual conversation. It's kind of 1 year at a time. And so I expect that that may be an issue that is part of the budget.
Sometimes how we close the alligator gap.
And eventually that adds up.
Yes,
and
it
our
does.
designated agencies can't do their work anymore. Yes.
Yeah, that is a pressure.
So the other pressures, and we made a significant progress, I think, last year in the pension realm, but that's still something that'll be part of the budget construct, is looking at our unfunded liabilities. I think this year with the volatility in the market and the impact that has on our pension system will be an issue that likely may need to be addressed. And then initiatives can be any range of things, right? One of the things on our radar at the Joint Fiscal Office is the need for additional state match on federal programs. Unprecedented federal funding opportunities, but they do come with state match requirements. And so Agency of Transportation, Agency of Natural Resources, I think some of the broadband build out that we are going to be contemplating will all come with the need for state funds as match. I think because those may be kind of time limited funding opportunities from the federal government, we can have a conversation about the use of one-time dollars to fund those match needs over the course of the next 3 to 4 years. But that'll be an important conversation, an important need of general fund dollars. And then initiatives could be anything from housing, as we've already discussed, to childcare, to further workforce development, and any other kind of area of strategic investment that the state will want to make, because we still are really dealing with unprecedented one-time balances and the choices that we'll need to make.
Climate change might be in under that initiatives.
Yes, yes. And the legislature on that note laid out, I think it was Act 74, which was the FY22 big bill a few years ago, some big areas of strategic investment to include broadband, climate change, clean water, housing, and then supports for communities. Those were the 5 big buckets. Hopefully I'm not missing any of them, but that is something that we also track in our office, because we have been able to make very significant investments in those broad areas, both leveraging general fund dollars and federal dollars, but it will be important for us to watch the progress of those investments in the future.
And I think once you see the impact of that scale of spending, it's really hard to stop wanting to do that, because you see what a difference it makes for Vermonters. Andy?
Does JFO look at one-time education spending, like remediation for PCBs in schools?
I think that that's a great teaser for one of the presentations that's coming later this morning. My colleagues, Julia Richter and Graham Campbell, will be talking to you about some of those. Yes.
And the other thing we haven't talked about, but the math scores are in nationally, and it looks like the COVID remote learning is taking its toll across the board. And I'm assuming somebody somewhere is going to want to do some extra investment into helping get kids back up to speed.
Let's talk about that with Julia, because I have
Yeah.
a question about that too.
But that's out there.
So that's really a high level of the general fund into the future.
Thanks. I mean, I've also heard a lot about how there's a possibility that our revenues will continue to be much higher than they're projected because of, folks moving into the state. As the wealth gap grows, that means that, the wealthy in our communities have more money than they had before, and that shows up in our revenues as well. Because one of the wild things about inflation is that people profit from it.
It's a small slice.
Yes.
So we will get the first we're probably getting it by withholdings now, but we won't, because there's there's people that have been working here remotely who may or may not stay. We'll probably get the first solid indication when the taxes get filed.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Same with corporate.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Discussions are always uplifting.
I love it.
Thanks. So moving to the education fund, which we all know. I just had a flash of remembering that Peter is remote, and so I am watching for a hand from him, but if anyone else happens to notice a hand, then I don't.
Yeah, where is Peter?
Peter's camera's not on, which is fine. He's welcome to keep it off, but a little yellow hand will show up. As everyone remembers Zoom, how that works, it will show up.
Oh,
Right? Okay,
Go
so,
sleep.
good.
You can always just interrupt.
And he can also, Peter, please feel free to interrupt if no one notices your hand. So education fund, totally different from general fund in that it, it self-regulates to a certain, it fills itself. And there have been something that Anne's brought up a number of times is how many changes we've made in it over the last decade. And so the trend lines might not be as clear. And so Abby's going to take us through some of those changes we've been making. Great.
Thank you. For the record, Abby Shepherd, Office of Legislative Counsel. My presentation is a little more wordy and focused on legislative action than Graham and Julia will be following up with some more charts to talk about the revenue side. So this is really a resource for all of you. I've put all the links if you really want to go look at all the different acts that have done this, but it's a nice summary of really the big changes. As I go through, I will point out there are a few things that I left off that weren't such large revenue impacts, mainly in sales and use tax. But to start, I haven't gone back a full decade for all of this because so much was really not front loaded, but the last 6-7 years have seen significant changes in revenue, both because of national changes. I am also going to just really focus on the revenue side because that's my area working in tax law. So what's coming in as opposed to the expense side, but I have provided a list and then Graham and Julia will talk about that in more detail. So to start, that's actually page 2 of the slides if you want to follow online or on your paper. I have noted where revenue allocations were amended in legislative action. And to frame why this happened in 2018, this is right after the Federal Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was enacted. That was at the very, very end of 2017. And in response, Vermont made significant changes to personal income tax and changed some of the, so that's more general fund, but also made these education fund changes. So that's why this happened in 2018. So on this first slide is just laying out the changes to how revenue is moving between the funds. So the general fund transfer that had been around 300,000 increased with an inflator annually since 2016. That transfer was repealed in 2018. So there's no longer a general fund transfer to the ed fund. Instead, sales and use tax revenues were dedicated 100% to the ed fund. And I noted previously it was 64% to the general fund, 36% to the ed fund. Several years before that, that had been tweaked slightly by a percentage or two. I believe it's 34 to the ed fund, it was increased to 36. Additionally, meals and rooms tax revenues, which previously had gone 100% to the general fund, a quarter of those were moved to the education fund. And that comes up later in my presentation when I talk about making changes to the sales and use tax through exemptions. In particular, when you're looking at expenditures of that sort, they do impact the ed fund. Although meals and rooms tax, the impact is smaller. So pause there. That's sort of the simplest part of my presentation. If there are any questions about that, that's pretty straightforward. The rest, really where I'll spend a lot of my time today is on the next 2 slides. So sales and use tax and meals and rooms tax both went through significant changes in the last few years, primarily because of changes to the way that people are reserving rooms, the way that they're buying their goods, and also federal legal changes. So it's really a national impact that Vermont has reacted to. So actually I'll step back even further. In 1992, the US Supreme Court held under a case that some of you might be familiar with, Quill Corp versus North Dakota. It required states to not require vendors who are selling into their state to collect sales tax when they don't have a physical presence in the state. So this came out of a catalog solicitation. If there's only solicitation in the state, there's no nexus, the state couldn't tax those sales. So that was in 1992. Many states as internet blossomed, many more online sales, much more movement of goods through online remote sales. States started creating laws to challenge that, to make sure that there was a case brought before the Supreme Court. So in 2016, it began with South Dakota. South Dakota enacted a law that required out-of-state sellers to collect and remit sales tax when they had $100 of goods or services into the state, or they engaged in 200 or more separate transactions. So that was really a very specific target against the Quill holding. And it had those two thresholds as a way to exempt sort of the smaller sellers, which was important in the 2018 case Wayfair, which is often invoked as this big defining moment in sales tax, because it overturned the Quill physical presence requirement and allowed states, when they had a sort of reasonable minimum for small sellers, to be able to require online sellers to collect and remit in their state.
Abby, I find this totally fascinating, genuinely, and I don't think we need this level of detail.
Too much, okay. Was I getting too excited about all the details?
I was also excited, and I was like, I don't know if I need to know this right now. No, it's okay.
Thank you, that's helpful. So to go back to the slide, which is a little more high level, Vermont in 2016 foresaw this and created a contingent trigger. Wayfair by the Supreme Court, US Supreme Court overturned Quill. Vermont had this law that was contingent. It was triggered starting July 1st, 2018. Suddenly Vermont's getting, all of these remote sellers are required to collect. So you have this larger influx of cash. And then of course, with the pandemic, people at home ordering online, even greater impact. So I will stop there. If there are any questions about that, there probably aren't, because I gave too much detail.
No, but I'm giving the opportunity to flag the idea that local option taxes, which I think were originally thought to be paid mostly by tourists, after Wayfair wound up being paid a lot by locals who were shopping online, especially during the pandemic. So the split around local option taxes and who pays them has changed a lot. And this is just my opportunity to plug that idea. Continue on. Has nothing to do with what we're doing.
Exactly.
They shouldn't have said it.
I won't talk about it.
It's an amplified voice. So that was the big sales and use tax, the biggest change. The following year, so in 2019, make sure I get that right, 2019, Vermont enacted the Marketplace Facilitator Law, which sort of expanded its remote seller collection requirements so that third-party sellers on a marketplace such as Amazon Marketplace, the marketplace itself would have to collect. So that beefed up that sales tax collection requirement. Won't go into more detail there, but the thresholds are the same as for remote sellers in general, so that small sellers aren't necessarily being captured. Captured meaning subject to the requirements. There was also in 2020, the act passed, but of course the retail sales of cannabis have only just started, but the act in 2020, Act number 164, also created a sales tax on retail cannabis with some exemptions.
Will we have a sense of that sort of in the middle of November? I mean, now we'll have a month of data. When does the state have eyes on what that data is?
So that's a great question, perhaps for the tax department. I don't know if JFO has access to that, but you're correct. So there are different taxable sale thresholds for how often a vendor has to remit, and there's always that month lag. That's for the larger sales. So I don't know actually, based on how many sales and the value of those sales, how many cannabis retailers are already collecting and remitting monthly, or if they would be doing it on a quarterly. I don't know that, but it should be soon.
The cannabis sales they pay the 6% sales tax, but there's an other tax.
Correct.
Right, the 6% sales tax is divided just like the other sales tax, or does not divide it anymore, it goes to the ed fund, but can you remind
Excise tax.
of the breakup, does any of that other money, or is that already appropriated?
Go to the ed
That's just
fund.
general.
I don't actually know. I would have to work on it.
20%.
It goes in the general fund, but so one way it could impact the ed fund is that a huge portion of it goes to prevention, and after school is considered prevention. And a lot of districts pay for after school out of their budgets, though other districts don't pay for after school out of their budgets. And so it affects school budgets, sort of. Oh, and you're an after school champion.
Yes. Do you want me to wear my cape?
Would like you to wear your cape always, yes.
That is all I have for this slide on sales tax. The next is on meals and rooms. So only 25% of those revenues are going into the ed fund, but and changes do impact. So also going back to about 2016, that's at the time interpretation was that a hotel and operator, those were in the meals and rooms tax statute, were broad enough to capture short-term rentals, but there's been a lot of work since 2016 to tighten those definitions, make it clear that short-term rentals are required to collect when individuals are renting, such as on such platforms as Airbnb. Airbnb is collecting on their behalf. So there's that influx of revenue into the funds that's been occurring since 2016. And there have been multiple legislative changes since then, just to make it clear. That's not on this slide, but just setting that stage. So similar to the Wayfair, there's this larger moment, and then there have been successive legislative changes which have increased revenue from meals and rooms tax. So in the rooms tax side of collections, one of the legislative changes in 2019 was to expand the definition of operator to include booking agents. So an example would be Expedia or any sort of online, doesn't necessarily have to be online, but that's just typically where these reservations are happening. Online travel agent charges are subject to the rooms tax. So that was in 2019.
When you say charges, you mean the charges to the customer or the booking agent's 2% fee?
To the customer. So it's always on the final sale.
So it includes their fee and the whole fee for the everything.
So previously that was not being subject to the sales tax, or the meals.
What I pay, not what Expedia pays to the hotel. What I pay is not what the hotel gets.
There was, I think it's fair to say the feeling was there was a lot of room to be creative in how you structured it. And so we said, this will alleviate that.
And is that also true for DoorDash type things?
Yes, so that's the next page. And the legislature.
Oh, it's right there, sorry.
Not last session, but the session before. So was a similar proposal because there are so many delivery services, they had a similar sort of fee structure where they would be paying the restaurant a certain amount, but the customer would be charged more and the tax was being applied on the lower amount. So this expanded it. Everything that the customer is paying is subject to tax, and the sale between the delivery person and the restaurant in the DoorDash example, that is an exempt sale.
Okay.
So that wouldn't be subject to tax.
What about, I'm forgetting the names. They're on TV all the time. They deliver you a box of raw material with
Blue Wave.
cooking instructions. One of them, I think, sells you a microwave and all of their things go in their microwave. Are those?
They're called meal kits.
Meal kits, okay. Are those subjected, because groceries aren't, so
So it would have to be a taxable meal, so it'd have to be for,
it would have to be a meal, all right.
that's a good distinction.
Yeah.
And hopefully the microwave would be subject to the sales tax.
I think we'd catch the microwave, yeah.
Yeah, so those were the changes to meals.
So all those people that have coffee delivered to their office, and my children tell me there are a lot, are paying the tax on that delivery fee.
The actual prepared coffee.
Yes.
Warm beverage, yes.
Yeah, and they pay $1 extra or $3 extra to get it delivered, that's all.
It's all subject to tax.
May they continue. Okay.
So that is the extent of the revenue increases going into the ed fund over the last few years, which have been significant and given the pandemic were amplified.
And these revenues will rise with inflation, right? As the cost of the meals rise, this is one that will rise.
That's correct, because it's on the charge to the customer. So if the price is increasing, then the tax revenues will also increase because it's a percentage of the charge.
Okay.
And I have a question about credit card fees, but I don't think we need to talk about it now. But I'm just saying it to remind you that I want to talk to you about
Sure.
credit card fees and how that gets dealt with in this whole thing.
Okay.
Right.
We had fun with that a few years ago. I don't know if we were
Well,
successful.
it definitely reduces money going into the general fund. businesses have to expense it.
Yeah, I mean, at some level, the retailers
Yeah.
actually pay more in fees. If you charge a pack of gum, it costs the retailer more in fees
Yeah.
than he's making on the pack of gum.
It certainly shows up in the net income of businesses.
Yeah. I think that's another fun discussion.
Different discussion from the ed fund revenues, but I'll be happy to connect with you about that after. The next few slides will look at expenses, both that have already been booked, and then in the final slide, looking at reserves and studies, and, or sorry, the penultimate slide, looking at reserves and studies that will likely result in a decrease to ed fund revenues. So some of the expenses that occurred in the last several years, this is the furthest back is 2017, just to give you an idea of when this was more recently added to the ed fund. So teachers' pensions, the normal cost was added as an allowable use of the ed fund in 2017. And then, as you already looked at today, and I know Julie and Graham will talk about it more, the OPEB, the other post-employment benefits for teachers. In 2021, there was a $14 million reserve set aside in the ed fund for OPEB. And then in the pension bill this last session, that normal cost was spent. So that was also added as a allowable use from the ed fund.
What is the normal OPEB annual amount? Like, is that 14 million? Was that prepaying several years, or that's just a part of 1 year, or what?
I believe the cost that was spent, and I'd have to look at the act, I don't have it with me, was 15 million, but into Julie.
Oops. Get into the numbers.
Yeah, and part of that was
Number of people.
capitalizing the fund, right? We had not capitalized the.
Let's save these questions for
Yeah.
Graham and Julia.
They
Prepare
do
for them.
that.
To our pensions attorney, because it's 100% out of my area. There were also special education funding changes in 2018. So that was Act 173, and that changed the funding model from reimbursement to census-based. There, in the last session, there were the universal school meals that were set aside. 29 million for universal school meals in 23 only. And then there was a study as well. And I know the later presentations will get into that in more detail. So that may be a potential future cost to the ed fund.
The other potential cost of the ed fund that I'm realizing isn't here is the possible likely changes in spending related to the weighting study,
That's true. That is not listed.
which were not like determinable, but there's definitely a lot of folks who think that that will create growth.
That's a great.
They'll spend it.
In terms of what hasn't actually been spent, but what's sort of coming down the pipeline, PCBs. So $32 million were reserved for PCB investigation, testing, assessment, reading, any sort of PCB remediation. There was an emergency use authorized for the interim. There's a plan that that AOE, the health department, and one of the, I think AHS have to submit about how to disperse for PCBs. That'll be coming at the beginning of next session. And then there's this emergency use authorized in the interim. 15 million.
Wait 1 second.
Oh, yes.
Money that you guys on the Joint Fiscal Committee released the other day, that is out of this 32 million?
That was the e-board, which I'm not.
Oh, it's the e-board.
E-board, and I was down with the stomach virus, so I didn't make it, but the plan was 2.5.
Out of this 30.
So the 32. So the two schools can go to the next step, which is identifying the source and developing a remediation plan. And then the state is going to be pre-buying. There's some basic material that goes into these minor things, and they're going to bulk buy and then, or bulk.
And the
buy.
money wasn't released to the districts. It was released to ANR. ANR.
Yeah.
To, I think,
Or might be AOE.
ANR is really taking the lead on
They're
this.
doing.
to help with remediation. And what was important for me to learn about this is that sort of the scale of the situation in Burlington is not necessarily the scale that every district will experience. So there's a little bit in one school in my district and it's not.
They don't have to tear down the whole.
They don't have to like tear down the whole building and move to a shopping mall, which is great because we don't have any shopping malls in Brattleboro.
Right, same with Cabot.
Yes.
Macy's.
Yeah. Well, Cabot's going to get its money, so,
Yeah.
for now.
Empty barns.
For some reason Cabot calls Jane Kitchell because they're in the
close.
Danville School
Yeah, yeah,
District.
right.
They aren't calling me.
Back to you, Abby.
There were also two other areas that were identified, which are CTE, career technical education. $15 million was appropriated to Vermont Housing and Conservation Board for this fiscal year for purposes, several different purposes. I think that the later presentation talks about that briefly as well, a revolving loan fund for housing. There are also studies and reports required on funding and governance models. I believe that's both JFO and agency reports. There will be a lot more.
15 million was going to the tech school so that they could, I think it was more rehab apartments,
Housing.
It was to build how it was to practice building housing.
building or rehabbing,
Workforce for housing.
right?
And it was a one-time expense. It was a revolving fund that was set up. It wasn't a program that was created.
There are more studies and reports coming to recommend long-term funding.
Around CT generally, not around the VHCB.
Sorry, yes, CTE general. And there is also school construction. So there was a 2022 study on school buildings and then actual assessment that was pushed out a year. So that will be due to the legislature in 23.
Peter has a question.
Not so much a question as a comment.
Thank you.
Kind of falls in line with Emily, what you said with it doesn't have the pupil weighting in here. The other thing is that schools have been getting unprecedented amounts of federal funding that they've largely used to increase staffing in areas such as interventionists, as well as programming such as after school and summer. And I know that our school board, we just met on Monday, and there's a lot of talk about a lot of these positions that we've created keeping. We're good through 24 with the federal funding to cover this, but after that, I think that that's going to be yet another major pressure on the ed fund as well. And in terms of the PCB's situation, we simply have no idea. I mean, sure, Brattleboro may have a small issue, but it's just getting started, and we simply have no idea what that's going to add up to.
Thanks.
Okay. The final slide does talk about sales and use tax sort of writ large and expenditures. So anytime there's an exemption created, just to, and everyone, as you're all well aware, that those are reducing revenues that are going to the education fund. And I have sort of a short list here, but there are many more. I could think of 3 or 4 others, but what's on here is sort of the larger ones. One of which is an issue that comes up sort of every session since 2015, sales and use tax on pre-written computer software that's accessed remotely. It's typically called cloud tax. So you're looking at online access to computer software that was exempted by the legislature in 2015, and then whether or not to tax that or how to tax that has come up pretty much every session since. Also, the menstrual products exemption that was enacted 2 years ago. The wood pellets added to residential energy fuels as an exemption. And then there are some small exemptions for both cannabis and cannabis products. And then just last session, there was a small cannabis cultivator sort of clarification that they're allowed to have the same ag and supplies exemptions that other farmers, agricultural uses are, to make sure that it's clear that they can take those exemptions.
Thank you. This is really helpful for me to just remember that we're hyper focused on this one lever in the ed fund and that there are a lot of other levers in the ed fund that impact dollars flowing around just as much.
But to be fair, the only one that is even anywhere close to 1 million or more is the cloud tax.
Sure is.
Quite-
That's a good point.
quite-
I did not put numbers here, but these were all quite small expenditures. They're just ones that are talked about, have been talked about frequently.
Unless you want to go for groceries.
What's that?
Unless you want to go for groceries.
And I meant the entire,
Like tar and feathering?
I meant that the entire slide deck is a helpful reminder.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
yeah,
The
yeah.
intentions are just,
Yeah.
But the other thing that is not here is the first, at least in my time, tax study suggested we look at taxing services, which is where the bulk of the money is being spent right now. That's where the economy is shifting.
give people a very nice property tax break if we tax services.
Or cloud.
Well, unless.
Not your haircut.
The scale is not
Yes, yeah,
the same.
yeah.
And I don't know that we have to tax all services. Because you're going to tax my haircut was the thing that hit all the letters to the editor last time it came up. But you can tax some of them,
Yes, that's a policy decision you can make.
right?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Debbie.
It's Graham? Yes. Hello,
There's
Graham.
Graham.
There you
The sun
are.
is out wherever he
You
is.
do have some very nice lighting working for you today, Graham. You look like a little angel.
I wanted
No,
to have
no
this
sun in
glow on
Vermont,
me.
Graham.
Yeah, no, it's kind of a cloudy day here too, but I wanted to have the glow on me for this this presentation a bit.
Absolutely.
Can you arrange a halo?
I'll talk to whoever sets up the arrangement around here to get the halo done next time I come. So I'm Graham Campbell from the Joint Fiscal Office. Julie and I have prepared a presentation for the committee on Ed Fund budget pressures. It should be on the committee's webpage. I'm not going to share it, but I'll tell you what slides I'm on as we go through. This is sort of the sister presentation for what my colleague Sarah Clark did for the general fund. This is not typically a presentation we do for the Ed Fund. And so it'll be slightly different than what Sarah talked about. And that's largely because the Ed Fund, as we've sort of said before, is kind of a special fund that behaves differently from the general fund. And I'll dive deeper into what that means as we go into the presentation. So if you all have any questions, please feel free to stop me. And there may be questions for which I don't have the answer to, but Julia also might chime in as well. So the first slide of this presentation is our attempt at making the alligator chart. So before I sort of get to the message about pressures here on the expense and revenue side, I want to point out some things that are some interesting facts about this chart. So the first thing I want to point out is how we did this chart. So you'll see the green block here, which is the non-property tax revenues. Over the course of fiscal year 2012 to 2018, the vast majority of that was the general fund transfer. And as Abby talked about, 10 minutes ago, in fiscal 19, that sort of changed up where all the sales tax got dumped into the Ed Fund. 25% of the meals and rooms tax got put into the Ed Fund. And so there is sort of a seminal change in fiscal year 2019 in this chart, in that green portion of it. So everything prior to the sort of solid black line in fiscal year 23 is actual revenue performance. So for the green block, it's non-property tax revenues. In many years, it's the general fund transfer, but in forward years, it's the sales tax, it's the meals and rooms tax, the purchase and use tax, the Medicaid transfer. And then for the property tax, the big blue block, that's actually what we collected in property tax revenues net of the property tax credit. And so being the Ed Fund, that blue bar really is, I guess for lack of a better term, backed into for the ed fund. We set the yields to raise the appropriate amount of money after accounting for how much in non-property tax revenues we have. And the goal is to match that red line. So the red line is more or less set every year by school districts around the state. There's categorical aid that goes into that red line. And so, but every year the legislature knows what that red line is likely to be, and then it knows what the projection is for the green box, and then it sets the yields to make sure that that blue section fills up essentially that gap. And so the projection here for the red line, so the dotted line on this, the dotted part of the red line, is the compound annual growth rate for education fund uses. That's all the uses in the ed fund. So school spending, so it's voted on for school budgets plus categorical aid from fiscal year 2012 to fiscal year 2023. And that is about 3.1% a year. What that line does not include is kind of what Abby touched upon earlier, and what I will touch upon in the other future slide, is sort of these potential pressures on the spending side. So things like universal school meals, OPEB, the teachers OPEB, normal cost teachers OPEB, any additional money for CTs, things like that are not included in this projection. The only sense that they're included is that we have 1 year of data where some of it was included. So universal school meals in fiscal year 23. Well, we are not assuming in this dotted red line that, upwards of $25-30 million is going to be added for universal school meals or school construction, et cetera. We thought about it, but on the flip side, school budgets could come in lower than we expect. So this is sort of a baseline scenario for education spending in the ed fund going forward. So just take that with a grain of salt. The green part of the projection, the non-property tax revenues, is purely just coming out of the July 2022 forecast, because that's the majority of non-property tax revenues. There is the assumption here that the Medicaid transfer, which is about $12 million, that is held sort of constant through the projection. So that's sort of the background of what you're looking at here. The second thing I want to point out about this slide is note the scale, right? So total education fund spending beyond 2023 is about $2 billion a year. And so you've heard me come into the committee and talk about how, property tax is pretty reliable and the other stuff is a little bit more volatile. And you might notice sort of the green block down here looking relatively smooth. And that's just because the scale that we're talking about is very large. So the non-property tax revenues are only about 700 to 750 million in the education fund of the 2 billion. And so when you're looking at it on this full scale, it looks relatively smooth. But if I were just to zoom in on just the green one, it would be considerably more jumpy, if you will. So the other thing I want to point out in this chart is the general fund transfer came into effect for fiscal year 2019. And then you see sort of a flattish revenue for the green box for the first 2 years. And then you see an uptick in the green box. And that's the COVID years. And that's mostly the sales and use tax and the purchase and use tax, which have been operating, or we've been collecting at a much higher plane than we did pre-pandemic. And that's expected to continue into the forecast. The growth rates are expected to slow a little bit, but the forecast does not predict that we are going to essentially quote unquote crash down to earth on those non-property transfer or those non-property tax revenues over the projection horizon. So, yes.
I just want to point out, it's not just COVID, it's also Wayfair coming in too.
That's right. So I think what I would say about that is it's twofold. So one, we don't track this on a yearly basis, but when Wayfair was passed, the tax department was tracking how much money we were collecting from new vendors that were not collecting before, that did not previously, or that had sort of an out-of-state address on their sales and use tax return. At the time in 2019, it was about 20 million extra dollars coming into the education or into the sales tax from that. And so that was in 2019. Then you have the marketplace facilitator law, which brought in sort of the marketplace, the marketplace sales. So Amazon Marketplace, eBay, Etsy, stuff like that. And that was estimated at the time about $16 million. And that was in fiscal 19 when we did that. And so you have these two big broadening of the base. Just by making those changes, you have approximately $40 million in extra sales tax revenue. But then you have COVID, which really juices online sales buying. We projected that prior to the pandemic, online sales were about 10 to 15% of total sales tax revenues. And we haven't done this in Vermont specifically, but I've seen other states try to estimate this and sort of national think tanks. And right now it's estimated to be closer to 30%. And so you have the sort of boosted revenue just from making those legislative changes, but then you have the fact that COVID comes along and changes the dynamic of how people buy things. And so it's really fortunate that the legislature passed the marketplace law and that we had the appropriate legislation in place to pick up the sales from when Wayfair was repealed. So we were able to capture that big COVID bump. So a huge bump in the sales tax revenues due to online sales.
And then,
So, go ahead.
Graham, in the blue, how much of this is homestead and how much of it's non-homestead?
Let me just check the math here. So the total blue for fiscal year 23 is about 1.2 billion. And the homestead part of it is about $430 million, and the non-homestead's about $675 million. So I'm netting out the property tax credit there.
Third of.
The homestead's a third.
Yes.
And is that consistent over time?
Well,
I'm sorry, I didn't
It's
ask
a
it.
third of this 2/3 in a way, right?
Yes, but is it, does that ratio change over the 5 years, 15 years you're showing us? I'm sorry, I didn't ask you that before you were right there.
Yeah, it's been pretty steady. Generally, it's been about 56 to 58% in over the past, since 2012 to about 2019. But then it's dropped to about 53, 52% thereafter. So this goes along to my next point, actually, a really good transition here. The transition here is that there are no, I don't want to say there are no pressures in the ed fund, but unlike the general fund, the pressures are always solved by setting the yields, right? So whatever is added in terms of expenditure, the yields are sort of there to pick it up. But the other thing that I'll sort of say here as a takeaway home for this chart is that because non-property tax revenues have been so strong and are projected to be so strong, the property tax is going forward expected to carry less of a burden than it has in history. So you can see in this chart, it was about a third of the total revenues needed to fund education in the state. And going forward, it's expected to be about 64.5%. And that same story goes for the homestead tax. As I said, it was about 55 to 58%, depending upon the year. But going forward, it's projected to be sort of in the 52 to 53% range of the total property tax revenues. And so what I'm saying here is that the property tax is going to be carrying less of a burden going forward if non-property tax revenues continue to perform the way they do. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So moving to my third slide, again, this is some of the takeaways that I just said, but the pressures in the ed fund, unlike the general fund, are always typically addressed by tax rates, rather than the general fund, which has to sort of make adjustments on both sides of the coin, on the expenditure side and the revenue raising side. And this is what I just said, that non-property tax revenues are expected to take pressure off of the property tax. So non-property tax revenues are expected to be closer to 35 to 36% of total education fund uses going forward. And just to give you a sense of what that means is that had non-property tax revenues continued to be about 33% of the total fund like they were in history, then that would mean an additional $30 to $50 million onto the property tax rates. So in a sense, it's not that sort of 1.5% difference doesn't look like much in terms of the chart, but because the scale is so large, you're talking, at the end of the projection horizon, about $50 million of sort of pressure that's being relieved from property taxpayers, both on the non-homestead side and the homestead side. So that's sort of the main takeaway that we had when we were putting together this chart on pressures. But I want to talk a little bit more specifically about the revenue and the expenditure pressures that we see going forward. So on the revenue side, even though the non-property tax revenues, we do have a forecast for that, and that's what we rely on for this chart. The pressures we see on the revenue side largely relate to uncertainty in the forecast. When Tom Cavett and Jeff Carr made their presentation in July about the revenue forecast, the word uncertainty was used maybe 100 times. And that's because the economic environment that we're in right now is extremely volatile. It changes from month to month. We have a situation where the Federal Reserve is raising interest rates to intentionally cool the economy, but at the same time, we have very robust job growth. And so it's a lot of conflicting economic signals going on right now. And so the economists do their best to, make a projection of the non-property tax revenues, but there's a lot of uncertainty involved with that. So just to give you a sense of scale here, the non-property tax revenues in the education fund their growth is expected to slow over the projection horizon to about 3% a year. Whereas during COVID, they were going at a much hotter clip than that. But if things sort of go sideways and we start looking at a recession where there's a decline in revenues or a sort of really big crash down to earth, I just want to give the committee a sense of scale that, a 10% drop in non-property tax revenues during the projection horizon is about $75 million in total revenue declines. So it's large, but in terms of the scale of the education fund, that we're talking about 7 cents there on the tax rate, a little more than 7.5 cents on the tax rate. And that's assuming the grand list as it exists today. So if the grand list were to grow, it might even be less than 7.5 cents. On the expenditure side, before I get into sort of the more specific budget pressures, speaking broadly about overall ed fund uses, expenditures have been basically tracking a little bit above inflation for the last 10 years. So as I said, about 3.14% when the inflation rate was just over 2. So we assume for this analysis that they will continue to grow at that level, but there'll be lots of sort of ups and downs, in any given year. Last year, the growth in school spending was 5.7%. So, given the needs of school districts, I would say that's, aside from the sort of individual identifiable pressures on the ed fund, like PCBs, universal school meals, school construction, the biggest item in the ed fund on the expenditure side, as is always, what school budgets are, right? And that's sort of the biggest wild card, is, as I think Representative Conlon said, is we're sort of assuming here that they'll keep tracking close to 3% a year. But if those come in even slightly above that, you're talking the order of tens of millions of dollars difference, because the base that we're talking about is so large. So that any sort of increase in education spending on school budget, locally voted school budgets, is going to eat into that release of pressure that is given because of the non-property tax revenues. So we don't exactly know how that dynamic is going to play out, but because there's less burden essentially being put on the education property taxes, there is a chance, with other reasons such as the weighting study, the effective weights, and the need to have students catch up because of COVID, that might drive education locally voted school budgets higher, which would easily and quickly eat up that sort of pressure, or that space that's created by the non-property tax revenues.
Graham, I know that the point of ESSER money was learning loss. And I remember there being how many years was that sort of, how many years of spending was ESSER supposed to be? And I know that a lot of them put it in reserves, so there's a few extra years on that, but.
I don't know. I don't know if Julia knows that off the top of her head, how long the tail on ESSER was.
24 or 26, one of the two.
I remember seeing like 1,000 tables and I don't remember what was on them.
I think they have to say how they're going to spend it by one point, and then they have to spend it by another point. I think it's
That's correct. It's has to be sort of accounted for by FY24, and then it can continue to be spent after that.
Into 26 or forever?
I think probably just into 26.
And then we know that, so that like with reserves that people are building because of that, maybe takes us into 27.
I think you're making an assumption about reserves that may not be necessarily true. A lot of reserves get spent on construction.
Okay, I just remember Brad talking a lot about the reserves from ESSER.
Yeah, in the early ESSER years, it definitely helped.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to convey here is I don't want the committee to sort of quote unquote, lose the forest for the trees here, because I'm going to be talking over the next couple slides briefly about specific identified pressures in the ed fund. But by far the biggest pressure on the ed fund will always be locally voted school budgets. And even a change in the growth rate, up or down relative to its historical average, has a drastic impact on the quote unquote pressure on property taxes. And I would be remiss if I didn't sort of say that the dynamics of schools in Vermont, the fact that we have declining student counts, although that may potentially be reversing with some migration, but we've had declining school count, children in our schools for at least the past 15 years. And so even though we have growth of about 3%, it's sort of on a pure pupil basis, we're going to be, that number is going to keep growing going forward. So that's sort of the overall headline picture of what we see happening in the education fund. That there's not necessarily pressure, quote unquote, because tax rates will always cover the difference. There's no alligator chart like there is in the general fund. B, that if things keep going as we project, then pressure on the property tax will be less than it has been historically. And C, the overall education fund expenditures, locally voted school budgets will be and will continue to be the biggest pressure on the ed fund. But with that being said, we do have these sort of what I'm calling clearly identifiable legislatively discussed proposals that would put additional pressure on the education fund. And we've kind of ordered these in what Julie and I have discussed is more concrete versus less concrete. So things that have actually been legislated or put into the ed fund versus things that have a study around that we don't necessarily have a cost. And the first one that is very clearly going to be a pressure on the ed fund going forward is the fact that last year with the pension deal, the normal cost of teachers OPEB has been put into the ed fund and will remain there. That's a cost of about $15 million in fiscal year 2023. But how much that ends up costing the ed fund in a given year will depend upon what the assumptions are for the actuarial modeling for funding, for pre-funding essentially, normal cost of teachers OPEB. So if the Treasury's consultant says that, given the inflationary environment, the economic environment, it doesn't make sense to assume 7% returns, we should assume 6%. The cost of that change would be quite significant for teachers, for that line in the ed fund.
What's the range of that, Graham, when you say quite significant? So it might go from 15 million to 16 million, or it might go from 15 million to 45 million?
I would say not the former, probably closer to the latter. I'd have to talk to Chris about it, but you're talking probably more than just, single millions of dollars there. Because these things play out over such a long projection horizon that a small change in the assumptions leads to a significant change in the total cost that you need to fund for normal.
Tripling.
Yeah, Graham, there was a pension or OPEB that was 6 million, and I was told because the investment projections didn't come in, it went to 36 million 2 years ago. I know, Julia, do you know?
Yeah, so Julie Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. So I believe that you're talking about the normal cost of teachers' pensions. So that was already in the education fund.
Right.
And then the inclusion of the normal cost of teachers' OPEB is what's now coming in. So now we have an additional new line item with respect to teachers'
Okay, but that normal cost went from 6 to 36 million.
It went from 6.9 to 37.6 from FY21 to FY22, and that was largely due to a change in assumptions.
All right, so that's the scale. The assumptions were wrong, and it was a $30 million, roughly $30 million.
Bless you again with all your sneezing. Peter and Graham, can you hear Julia when she's speaking?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
No problem.
great.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add on that, just as a put a pin in it, is that the normal cost of teachers' pensions is just a larger fund than the normal cost of teachers, or the cost of teachers' OPEB. So I wouldn't expect it to be as big as the cost of teachers, normal cost of teachers' pensions, but I would say it's more than $1 or $2 million a year if they change that assumption.
Thanks.
Man, you can tell me that I can learn this later, but if OPEB is the post-employment benefits, what's the difference between the normal pension and the OPEB pension? They're both post-employment. Like, why is one considered OPEB and one not?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on pensions, but the normal cost of teacher pensions is basically every year we put money into a fund to fund the retirement benefits of those teachers who are retiring.
And then the other one's like healthcare and stuff.
Yeah,
I know healthcare, but we're talking about pensions just now.
This is you.
Sorry, Graham, you explain it. I'm sorry.
It's healthcare and benefits. I assume that's all that OPEB is.
That's OPEB.
So OPEB is primarily healthcare. So the normal cost teachers OPEB, the normal cost teachers pensions, which is that $39 million that Senator Cummings was talking about, that's the amount that we pay every year into this big pot of money so that the retirement benefit, the annuity, it's paid out of that. The normal cost of teachers OPEB is primarily healthcare. And so you're basically setting up the same fund for just paying out healthcare benefits to retired teachers. Prior to last year, we were not sort of using a system where we were contributing a little bit every single year to a fund for teachers OPEB. We were going as what's called a pay-go basis. So whatever the costs were, we were essentially just paying it primarily, actually almost entirely out of the general fund. Now, with the pension deal last year, we've set up sort of this funding structure, just like we do for the annuity for teachers OPEB. And every year we're going to be contributing, well, this upcoming fiscal year 20, or this year fiscal year rather,
Right.
$15
Well,
million.
I get that part. Is there any pension part, or is it all healthcare?
It's pretty much all healthcare. The annuity is the normal cost of teachers.
So the post-employment benefit is the annuity, that's the normal. And then the OPEB is the healthcare or any other sort of supplemental benefits separate from the annuity.
But
Could all be healthcare.
the
Which is
normal,
basically all healthcare.
the normal cost is for presently working teachers. So that the state pays into that annuity, right? And it's for the teachers that are working now. This
For
is
when they retire, though.
For when they retire.
Exactly. Yes.
So this is the employer's contribution is being paid out of the ed fund.
That's right.
So you're funding the annuity, plus we set up a system for capitalizing somewhat, basically healthcare for retired teachers.
But highly recommend getting a full pension tutorial at some point. It's a fun and important time.
I will say the lunch seminars were really helpful.
No, they were.
Okay.
So I'm moving on.
Graham.
School meals.
Yeah, so moving on to the next slide. School meals is kind of the next one that was in legislation. For fiscal year 23, we do have a universal school meals program. It's projected to cost $29 million this year. And so that was a one-time program set up by the legislature for one fiscal year. However, there is, in that legislation, there's a requirement by JFO to study future funding sources for universal school meals. So while this isn't technically an ongoing pressure in the education fund, it is for fiscal year 23. And then if the legislature decides to continue this program going forward, then that would be an ongoing pressure. At the time that this legislation passed, the cost of doing that ongoing universal school meals program was about $37 million, but that'll be revisited because we will likely have some more data on this year's universal school meals program that we can, revise that estimate in a more, I think, clear
Two
way.
moving parts on that. We kept being told that with these new forms, we'd find out we had more families eligible for federal support, which I don't know when we're going to learn that. But I'm assuming, does this figure in inflation in the cost of food? Because it's frightening to go to the grocery store right now.
I'll divert that one to Julia, who did the estimate, to talk through what's included.
Yeah, so Julie Richter, Joint Fiscal Office, the 37 million it didn't account inflation. It accounted for what the federal reimbursement rates were looking like and what the difference the state was going to need to make up. The estimate really relied upon two unknowns that we had to make our best estimate at, which were how behavior may change and how, with respect to filling out those income forms, and how participation may change over time. If free meals are available, maybe more kids will eat those free meals moving down the line.
I mean, there are also like so many moving parts on this, like depending on who's elected to Congress in November, we might see significant more federal investment in this. There was just a massive nutrition, like national convening that I think is going to affect all of this too, Chris.
Even if if we decline to continue with universal school meals, there is a cost for the contribution because we already had 70 schools, I think, doing universal meals. Mm-hmm. So is that 37 on top of that, or is that getting factored in, Julia?
So that 37 million is if universal school meals were to be expanded to the whole state. The schools that were already doing universal meals before the pandemic weren't necessarily a representative sample of the schools across the state of Vermont. A lot of those
Right.
schools.
No,
were
I
eligible for-
understand that, but it's just, I just wondered if that goes to zero or if it, comes down to 12 million to handle the 70 whatever schools that are already offering recipients.
So the 37 million is if universal school meals were to be expanded, the whole state. That is the additional cost that JFO estimates at this point in time.
Thanks.
But if the state stops officially doing it, but a lot of districts keep doing it out of their individual budgets, it's still going to go towards the ed fund.
Yeah, so then that would likely fall into the education payment line. It would be within the school budget, so it would be reflected in tax rates locally, but also would be reflected in the statewide yields.
That's a great point. So moving on to my next slide is PCBs, which this committee has heard a lot about, which is a lot in the news. There isn't any sort of defined program set up for PCBs yet, so it's not quite to the level of universal school meals or teachers OPEB. However, in fiscal year 23, there was, the creation of a PCB remediation and mitigation reserve of $32 million. And a plan for these reserves has to be presented to the General Assembly in January by ANR, AOE, and DHR. But the sort of full cost of remediation, we don't know at this point in time. But going to Representative Kornheiser's question earlier about changes in assumptions of pensions, I wouldn't expect this one to be, in the $1 million or $2 million range. I would expect this to be a larger item in the education fund. So
Can I
go ahead.
ask a question? I don't know if you're the right person to answer it, so I'm sorry if you're not, but we have this massive, maybe Peter knows, we don't know, we have this massive study about PCBs and we have a massive study about school construction. And is someone going to put those two studies together? Because it might be the exact same schools.
I don't know the answer to that question. And I don't
One
know.
is an estimation of just kind of the unmet maintenance.
Yes.
Capital needs. And the other one is we're testing the schools that then then doing the remediation or figuring out how much it's going to cost.
Yes.
So, but then you would be able to look at them once all the schools are tested. That's going to take several years.
And so the remediation costs, I guess I'm just thinking that it's possible the remediation costs won't be costs on top of the school construction, because in some schools it would be
The same thing.
the same cost. Okay.
Yeah. Like if they're going to tear down the gym anyway.
Yes.
Maybe that would be covered, yeah.
Okay. Or reglaze the windows or,
Right, or do a ventilation project.
yeah. Okay.
Before I continue to the next slide, I wanted to pause here and just note, so in my first slide, I talked about how, if the grand list sort of stays as it is right now, and non-property tax revenues continue to grow as they're projected in the forecast, the sort of pressure that's being relieved off the property tax is about $30 to $50 million because of the non-property tax revenues performing so strongly. And when I talked about that chart at the beginning, I showed that red line, which is the education fund uses, which didn't include, any of these, additional identifiable pressures in the ed fund. So what I want to say here is that just teachers OPEB, universal school meals, and PCBs, if those were all sort of enacted into law in some sort of ongoing basis, that would pretty much immediately eat up that additional relieved pressure on property taxes, just those three. And so we're not even talking about, any changes in school spending, locally voted school budgets, so long as that's, if that's higher than 3%, then this would be higher. So, you have what we project a sort of relief pressure on the property tax as a burden as the share of the education fund uses. But all it takes would be, just these three items to eat that up. in theory. And then we haven't even gotten to talking about any changes in locally voted school budgets. So it's a sort of quote unquote good news for property taxpayers, but it also is it's a very thin bit of pressure, or a small amount of pressure being relieved.
And Graham, the other thing that's going on, I'm hearing about is reappraisals. They're coming to my house on Thursday. Housing values have definitely gone up. So you're going to have some common level of appraisal issues. And whenever we do a reappraisal, normally, if the grand list goes up, the tax rate goes down, is the theory, but there's always some people that get caught in that. And that's going to cause some discussion. Because we've got a 3-year rolling average, but there is some concern out there. And some towns are definitely going to see a much greater increase than others.
I think that's an excellent point. This, to the extent that the grand list, goes up in value, that will take potentially pressure off rates, but not necessarily the total amount of money being raised, right? So
the bills should be the same.
The bills should be, they might, that's what I'm looking for. The aggregate bill will be the same,
right?
But it might shift between towns. Depending upon how reappraisals go, and how far off the CLA was in those respective towns.
Mm-hmm. But that I've had at least 2 towns contact me with concerns about that. So
right,
we won't know until we know, but it's out there.
I have a question that I think I should know the answer to, but I don't. If we bonded for school construction, the debt payment on that bond, does that come out of the ed fund, or do we just get to pick which fund that comes out of when we pass the bond?
Depends on.
Who's we?
Yeah, who's
Town,
we?
when they-
The legislature. I mean, if we bond, if the state bonds for school construction.
It's out of the capital, it comes out of the.
It used to come out of the capital.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think that would be a legislative decision. I think if a school district bonds itself, then the debt service out of that would come out of their school budget, which would be reflected in tax rates in the yield
Absolutely.
fund. But if the state did it as a whole, it would depend upon where you wanted to pay the debt service out of. I don't know. This is really stretching the limits of my knowledge, but several years ago, there was school construction coming out of the capital fund. But that doesn't necessarily mean
20 years ago. We
that
ended
doesn't
it until
necessarily-
we paid off the debt because we weren't able to do anything else. We had so
2007 or
much
something like that.
debt going into school construction.
Okay, I'll leave that question on the table and we can figure it out some other time. Thanks.
With the legislature, we can do what we want.
So moving on to slide, I guess I'm on slide 7 now. This is the childcare and pre-K funding debate or question. So the legislature has asked JFO and/or a consultant to complete a childcare study, which looks at the cost of funding a comprehensive childcare system in the state. And that's due in January. And that fund is going to have a cost associated with it. Now, we bring it up here because the question about cost, A, we don't know, but B, where that cost might fall if the legislature decides to pursue that goal is an open question. If it falls, if the legislature decides it's sort of an education expense, then it would obviously put pressure on the education fund, or whether it would come directly out of the general fund. But we flag it here because, for instance, if pre-K were to be funded out of the ed fund, then that would put pressure on the ed fund.
And right now, sort of similar to school meals, we have some districts that have essentially like universal full-time pre-K, even for 3-year-olds that they're funding out of their budgets, which comes out of the ed fund, and other districts not doing that.
And then there's after school, which we have the same kind of
Yes.
issue with.
So that's
Is
sort
it-
of a,
I guess, Graham, I said that because I'm wondering, so is it possible that if we fully funded childcare out of a different fund, then it would actually relieve some pressure on the ed fund because there's districts spending in that category right now that wouldn't be spending in that category anymore?
yeah, I just don't know enough about those districts that are funding it. I don't know whether it's coming out of school budgets or whether it's coming out of potentially some federal fund. I have no idea, so I can't speak whether it would relieve funding.
They're getting, for pre-K, they're getting what, a half a
They're
student
getting a
payment?
half a weight, but that's not necessarily a
weight, yeah.
payment.
Then there's the weights.
That is, I mean, it is
Yeah.
a weight, it's not a payment, yeah.
Comes in now.
Yeah.
Okay.
But what
But-
about the assistance? Did they get, did the school districts get assistance for pre-K for those families, for the?
Like CCFAP assistance? The ones that pay out, no, they don't, no.
So they're just carrying that cost in their school budget to where,
And some districts are and some districts aren't, yeah.
right, there's like go to the private preschool where they get that assistance.
Where the family does
Yeah.
and pays it towards, yeah.
So I don't know the answers to those questions. I can reach out to the relevant people at AOE and see, and DCF.
It's a moving.
It's okay, it's more just to say like it's a moving target, yeah, it's a moving target, and we don't know. That's good enough, thank you.
Yeah, and I think on this one, I would say, I'm just going to keep going back to this theme with Representative Kornheiser, that this one I think is going to be large.
Guaranteed.
I think this is probably going to be, closer to 3 digits, more likely to be closer to 3 digits in millions rather than 1 or 2.
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
The next one is CTE funding and structures. So Abby mentioned that last year we created this revolving loan fund for rehabbing of homes in the ed fund. That was one time in nature, but there is a study required by JFO or a consultant to look at CTE governance and structure by March. And the legislature, in theory, used that report to decide what type of structure for CTE or whether to apply a funding source to achieve that structure, or whether that change in funding source or that change in structure will require any additional funding. We don't know what that report's going to say, but I think there's a non-trivial chance that that report comes back and suggests additional funding for CTE. So to the extent that that CTE is carried in the ed fund to a certain extent right now, then that could be an additional pressure on the ed fund going forward.
It's entirely now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have a question about, so in the conversations I've had about CTE and when we set up this study, what I'd been hearing from constituents and in the legislature was that the challenge of CTE was that there were disincentives to enroll. The challenge was not that the system didn't have enough money.
Correct.
Is that what or did I just like never hear that part because I happen
It's
to be
been
focused on
years,
something
but
else?
that's what I used to hear.
Yeah, okay.
But I think I guess you get more enrollment, you get more money, but there is a money. The reason that comes up is because they're not getting the money from the students. But I think also why there's a governance question is because the governance is controlled by the school board that also.
Yes.
So my anticipation would be if the governance is just the CTE, they would pass budgets that were larger.
Okay.
Because they see the need of their own school and they don't have to go to the other board and try to ask for it. They still have to go to the taxpayers, but.
If that's how it was organized. Okay, thanks.
Well, Barry just spun off an independent.
Right. So we'll see
CTE. It
what
was
happens.
part of the Spalding High School. And now it's an independent with its own school board.
That's part of the district? Not part of the district, it's its own school district?
It's part of the district, but its own board. So they make their own budget decisions is the way I understand it. They just set it up.
I don't understand, but I don't have to
If you're a
understand
voter
that.
from Barry, are you voting on one budget or 2 budgets?
I don't know, actually. I assume it's still one. But
Yeah, okay.
But I don't know how you would do that when you have 2 boards.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Are they, if they
Superintendent.
fiduciary or, I don't know.
So like,
let's all figure that out some other day.
All right.
Okay.
6 months.
I guess the takeaway from that one is we aren't sure if that's going to involve more funding or not.
Yeah.
But it could, and because CTE is an ed fund thing, then it would put pressure on the ed fund if it did require more funding. The final slide, I'm on slide 9, is school construction. And while this is sort of, for at least since I've been working for the legislature, it's been talked about in sort of a, dark, ominous clouds way that, oh, we have, huge deferred maintenance. There is a study that's out there that's going to be produced that estimates sort of the need here. And so it is, I think, more than just a nebulous potential pressure on the ed fund at this point in time. But we don't know what that report's going to say, right? And what the scale of the cost is going to be. Again, I would not expect this one to be small. But in theory, that it's unclear how the legislature might address the issues with respect to school construction. It may not even end up being an education fund expense. So I would say that is school construction is definitely out there as a potential pressure to the ed fund, but not necessarily, because the legislature hasn't committed to putting any school construction in the ed fund. So just to wrap things up, some concluding remarks. Again, I said this at the beginning, but in the current system, unlike the general fund, any pressure in the ed fund, if there's a sort of alligator chart scenario, tax rates and the yields, are designed to be the pressure valve here to fill what is needed. And so for more or less in a traditional historical way, when there have been pressures, the property tax rates have shouldered the load. Coming down the pike, there are a number of potential education policy and funding pressures, that I just talked about in slides 4 through 9. And those are identified. But I would also add to that there is the known unknown, which is how much school budgets are going to be. And that is, I think, in many respects, just as important or even more important than the slides that were talked about between 4 and 9. And the final thing that I will say is that sort of any new expenditures that are put into the ed fund, whether they are legislatively done, things that we talked about specifically, or whether districts decide to spend more money, that will come at the expense of the shift in the revenue burden right now. So we're expecting, as I said earlier, that non-property tax revenues will help relieve some of the pressure on the property tax going forward. But to the extent that more or new programs are added to the ed fund, or school districts spend higher than their historical average, then that would essentially eat up that extra capacity. So,
and Graham, if there is a recession and the economists that was the uncertainty in a lot of the projections, excuse me, and that sales tax dropped, that would be picked up by the ed fund, by property.
That's right. So, as I said earlier, the sales tax dropped somewhere between 5 and 10% during the Great Recession. I'm trying to remember. Let's assume it's 10%, and let's say all revenue classes in the non-property tax revenues dropped similar to that. You're talking about $75 million. So that is a big number without question. But you have to remember the ed fund is, $2 billion total. And so, assuming the same grand list growth, or the same grand list as today, that's about 7.5 cents on the tax rate. And what that would mean relative to what I've talked about today is that the burden on property tax to fund the education fund would be sort of closer to its historical norm, if that makes sense. So right now, I would say we're in somewhat new territory where the non-property tax revenues are picking up about 1% to 2% more than they've historically done in the ed fund, and that's taken pressure. So if we had a recession, what would most likely happen if the legislature didn't do anything to raise non-property tax revenues is that would fall into the property tax, and it would revert sort of closer to what the burden has been historically. Yeah. So it's sort of it's a bad news scenario, but it wouldn't be a quote unquote unprecedented change in the property tax.
Okay. And we have sales tax and other taxes, but there's also the non-homestead tax. And I'm assuming that non-homestead residential property is going up on a line with homestead or maybe even steeper. But business property, at least to my understanding, has not increased at the same rate, that it's been much slower or flatter. And I don't know if that's you, does anyone know that? But are we seeing a shift there too?
Do you mean the valuation of commercial properties?
Yeah.
I think the increase in the valuation of commercial properties is lagging the growth in residential.
Yeah, that's what it's been historically.
But the problem is your second homes or your rental properties are not lagging, right? They're
Right.
exploding, but our system doesn't sort of,
Well, we only have
Burlington.
two categories,
Yep.
right? Yeah.
yeah.
We can
Yeah,
ask
that's,
PVR to come in if we want to
Yeah.
get deeper into that.
But our system would capture the value, just wouldn't tax it differently.
Well, but you're seeing it like in reappraisals, so all the landlords in Burlington, there's a less than 1% vacancy rate. A lot of them got property tax bill relief, right? Because the city appraised and looked at the downtown business office space that was vacant. And, that to me is not good. It doesn't,
They don't rise and fall on the same scale.
because we lump them together.
Yeah.
We're penalized by that.
The next thing on our agenda before lunch is a conversation. So let's finish
That's
with
what we started.
Graham and then we can have our conversation.
I just wanted to add one thing. This is somewhat unrelated in my presentation, but there was a question about cannabis and the sales tax and how it works in the ed fund. The cannabis, so there is the cannabis excise tax. So that's 14% on the retail sale of cannabis. And that money, which was just changed and how it's diverted last session, is going to flow entirely to the Cannabis Control Board next year and the next 2 years, I think. And that money is going to first be used to sort of backfill the deficit in the Cannabis Control Board, because they have been spending money to get the system up and running. And then it's going to be treated similar to how we do with like liquor. So they're going to revert a direct app back to us, to the general fund. And then that money will get divided between, or for certain purposes. So some for prevention. The sales tax is built for the cannabis is built into the July forecast for the sales tax. We don't identify, a separate line in the forecast for the sales tax, but the sales tax for from cannabis in the enabling legislation for the legal cannabis market says that money has to be used for after school programs, but the legislature to date has not created a program to specifically divert that money. So it's kind of a weird position right now where it's the sales tax notionally is for after school programs, but there's nothing there that sort of diverts the money to a specific after school program. So that's the story about how cannabis is getting, or how cannabis sales taxes are, benefiting the ed fund overall.
So the sales tax, all right.
Yeah.
And then the prevention money could also be after school, but that's going to a separate fund for a long time. Okay, thanks. Anything else before we let you go, Graham? Does anyone have any other questions for Graham before we? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Graham. Did look it up. Berry Tech Center is a different district, is a new district.
Also has its own fiduciary and.
Own
Yeah.
superintendent and everything.
Okay. So they'll have a,
Oh,
Because they're taking students from all these other
yeah, right.
districts,
And
other
there's a
districts.
couple of those, right? Eileen Aluzzi was the director, one up.
I think there's just one other one.
Kane.
And Springfield has a,
I don't think there's a separate, because
It's not a
Springfield
separate.
Springfield is its own school district
Okay.
in
You
and
have
of itself.
Riverbend down in the, I think that's separate. There's a few.
Peter knows all of
There
them.
are 5 now with the addition of Barry, and they are all self-governed independent school districts.
So voters vote
Voted.
on for sure.
Separate school boards, separate budget, everything.
You'll vote twice. You'll vote on the school and then on the tech center.
Yeah, blended tax rates.
Which, that'll be interesting to see how that plays out and the impact it has on the academic high school budget.
Yeah.
Well, it'll drop it significantly.
That's what I'm thinking. But if they are shifting out, because the tech school was part of the high school, so if that cost is being shifted to the new district, then the cost for the academic high school should go down, right?
Correct,
We
yeah.
aren't going to have to buy new machinery and equipment every couple of years or,
Equalized pupils will drop too.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's also possible
Okay,
the rate
be
will drop 'cause
interesting.
lower income kids might go to the tech school. Reflections, thoughts, how this sort of sets us up for the next conversation. I already said mine, which is that I just sort of have a heightened awareness of the other levers that are available and that are sort of moving through. And so when I've gotten stuck a few times thinking about making changes to the homestead and what we would need to do to get sort of the rates as even or as low as I would like for like sort of a clean curve, and realizing that there are other levers to put more money into the ed fund in order to sort of create those curves, non-homestead being one, services being another, so that the entire, even any possible additional expenses in the ed fund don't have to be carried by the homestead. They can be carried by something else.
I think when I look at the concluded remark, the big picture I get out of this is that our education last, 10, 15 years, education fund growth is about 3.1 or 2%, and inflation is about 2.1%. And that's the big picture. When your growth is a percent greater than the economy and you compound that over multiple years and decades, then the pressure has to go somewhere, and it goes to the property taxpayer, unless some other amount of money is dumped in there to relieve it. I think that's the big picture.
Because, yeah.
It also feels to me like relevant to our conversation and also not, right? We're charged with thinking about filling the ed fund with a different way. It's not, that doesn't change just because there's some big unknowns on the horizon. I think in fact you might argue that that's a reason to make a shift to as equitable a system as we can design, given that we are worried about the pressure down the road.
That's actually really resonant for me, because when I think about designing a tax system that'll be resilient to the future and we are going to see increased pressures down the road, I would want to make sure that that system was best set up for equity so that people aren't harmed by those pressures. If we're, say, providing, free school lunches to kids of families who need it, and then we're paying for that by taxing those exact same families, I don't think that's actually meeting the goals that we would be setting up policy-wise. And so making sure the system was built equitably to cover those costs seems even more important as those costs go up. Peter, do you want to add anything, or you just?
No, actually, Senator Pearson just really echoed what I was thinking, is that this information is good to know, but really our task at hand here is to develop a funding model that's more equitable. I have been, over our last meeting, sort of thinking about goals we talked about as we were coming into this. What are the parts that make up a good taxing system? And I'm not sure we've sort of gotten toward simplicity. And there were also some comments made about cost containment, which I'm not sure we want to go there. But I just think we should remember to keep in the back of our mind some of those goals that were laid out in the beginning.
Which are the goals that are, knowing that we can't meet all of them because a lot of them sort of counteract each other, what are the goals that you want to keep the most in mind as you're?
I'd have to go back and review them. I think simplicity is a great goal, but I think simplicity is very much in conflict with sort of progressivity, which I think is probably the most important thing.
And again, I'm going to say one of the issues to me is I want to make sure that when we're providing those poor families by taxing them, and I'm not sure we are because of the income sensitivity we have, that we don't find out that they're getting fed, but they can't get the mental health counseling or the physical health services or the housing services that they need. There's levers, but they tend to be like a balloon, and I want to make sure when we push it on this side, we aren't doing more harm than the other. And then there's the matter of timing. Is this the time to do it, given the state of the economy? All things could change in 2 weeks, and we could have a very different federal government we're dealing with. So
Yeah.
there's just lots of,
But
I feel like the switchboard wingy dingy lady that you can plug it in and pull it out, but there's just too many levers.
I guess I think about it a little bit differently. I've come away from the last two meetings being burdened by the enormity of the task and the complexity of it. And in a way, just in the last few days, re-simplified to not that question, should we? I don't think we're charged with, should we do this? We're charged with kind of, the way I think of it is, if people wanted to do it, it won't be me, I don't have a vote, how would you do it?
Okay.
Right, and so just, if for me, success would be us saying, we're not sure if you should do it, but if you want to do it, this is a way. We've tried to answer some of the big questions around renters, around, the high end. Do you have a bifurcated at all on property or straight income? Some of those kinds of questions, then recognizing maybe that goes nowhere unless there is people saying, yes, we should try to do this.
So that may be a more doable,
Well, that's what, yeah.
because it's just,
I started getting up out of bed again after
yeah.
And no, go ahead.
No, you're done.
I really appreciate that, partly because, obviously, no matter what we say, the legislature will be deciding whether or not we should do it anyway. So it's on some level a waste of energy to say we should do this or not do this. But also, even if the legislature, even if the majority of legislators say we should do this, there's still going to be these epic logistical things to figure out that there isn't time for. That's why these summer study committees or fall study committees exist, is to figure out the levers themselves. And I think it also makes it easier for us, the six of us, to sort of find our way through solving some of these problems if we're relieving ourselves of the should we and just moving into the if we. What's the best way to do it?
That might be, and that's where we're going this afternoon.
It is.
Okay.
Anyone else want to pop anything in, even in terms of sort of process suggestions? I'm sort of moving into I appreciate, Peter, what you were saying about sort of reminding ourselves of those principles and the dynamics of those principles. I'd like to keep them on the parking lot in order to stay centered on that. And I know Emily will help us with that when she gets back. She's not here this week.
I do have, in addition to the questions we've talked about, like renters and, should it be withholding and where does the local spending decisions show up? I think those are, as I'm sitting here, some of the bigger questions we have to do. And I hope our next couple of meetings, we can just kind of give ourselves the space to propose and discuss those things. But then there's also some other questions that might help inform us that would be valuable to me. For instance, I have understood that there have been prior attempts to have more than two property classifications, the non-homestead and homestead, and that's surfaced constitutional issues, people tell me. So I don't know when and where, but before too long, it would be really helpful to me to understand, if that's, I like that idea. There's some logic to that could inform some of this process or be an addendum to that proposal. But if it's a non-starter, then you should know that. So
We can have Abby talk about that. My understanding is if we start talking about residents and non-residents rather than like meaning people who live in the state of Vermont and people who don't live in the state of Vermont, rather than being a resident at that house or not being a resident at that house. It's just, it's not about homestead versus non-homestead or even homestead versus second home, commercial property, rental property. It's just, we can't tax like non-Vermonters differently than Vermonters. Yeah.
Right. So that if you have a home on Lake Carmine
yeah,
and you live in Vermont, you're going to get taxed the same as somebody from New York.
Who has a home.
Who are going to be in telling us that their houses are worth an awful lot less.
okay, well, so there are some questions like that to me, even around the sales tax onto services. I mean, do we, for instance, would we be allowed, Madam Chair, you mentioned, we don't have to put a sales tax on all services. Is that true? Or do we have a sort of equal protection? That's a question I have. The other one is, could you have a rate, do we have to have it 6%?
Right.
Could you have 4% on lawyers and or 4% on services and keep a 6% on?
I think I'm seeing a no.
I want to understand.
Yeah.
She's a lawyer though.
If you have.
I'm just teasing.
If we have broad categories where services are at X.
Right.
And sales remain at 6. Do they have to be, I would just like to understand our way
Do
through
that right now with sales tax and meals and rooms.
Yeah, I suspect that, but I just want to understand.
Dive into that more.
Right,
Yeah.
what we could do, because the original proposal was that if we taxed everything, we could lower the tax rate, which helped the Connecticut River Valley folks.
Some of us are in the Connecticut River Valley over here on this side of the table.
Yes,
Yes.
Not, right? We've decided we couldn't really knock it down.
yeah,
But anyway, I'm not seeing like a big slide presentation on these questions. It's just more like, just as we're discussing, maybe having staff at the table with us to help us avoid those pitfalls, because, we're getting a good basis here, but pretty soon we're going to be sad we didn't have more time to discuss amongst ourselves, I think.
But Chris, isn't that last comment, it seems like it's different than your earlier comment, which I agreed with, of like, let's figure out how to do an income-based system, and then somebody will figure out whether to do it. The question around different taxes on services is not that, but it impacts it because it impacts the education side.
For me, it is that, because I feel like when I've tried to look at potential models for this, in order to get the curve as sort of clean as I want the curve to be to make it worthwhile to create this huge administrative change, I think we might need other sources of revenue in the fund, or to, have the non-homestead be able to be an increasing share of the fund in order to get the rates where they need to be for a clean curve.
But I see those as two different things, and maybe that they happen not concurrently, but sequentially.
Well, I think I'm closer to where Representative Cornhusker is. You could web them together in that here's how you do it based on income, and here's some additional funding you could do so that you would bring down, right? And I think, or childcare. I mean, that is a big one. The legislature has dialed up a multi-year process. that bill is coming due one way or another, on, we'll decide yes or no, I guess, or how much.
And who's
Us,
gonna pay?
us having a little eye on, well, and if you tax services, maybe that would take care of that. And yeah, I don't know. So,
Service.
You're just using services as an example, right?
well, I mean, I'm using it as an
something else.
example of, I think a shift to income is a more fair tax system. But it is not a radical change in terms of who pays, and it is not going likely to deliver significant relief that voters, to middle-class voters, which is my goal. So if you know, that's why I keep asking, like, what if we expanded even who's paying the income tax, not just homestead owners, but taxpayer, you know, income filers. But that would be one way to expand the base. Another way would be to say, okay, let's also consider, you know, what happens if you generate $100 million from sales tax on services. You know, that would allow you to buy down rates and kind of come up with a package that way. Again, not we should do this, but here are some of the ways one could do these things.
Yeah, appreciate that.
For me, though, it seems like that is, for this committee, it's a lot to do. We're basically looking at all the taxes and how all the revenue.
What's helpful though is that all the other taxes are like much more administratively simple in some ways than this particular one, right? So, I mean, picking which services, sure, there's like some, it's not, I wouldn't say it's complicated, but not complex, right?
I just don't want, we only have, what, 3 meetings?
Yeah, yeah.
So I want to make sure we get our main goals done before we spend a lot of time on
Agreed.
the service tax,
Well, maybe,
cloud taxes.
Yes.
yeah, what we can do is this afternoon, we'll get some ideas about how we could go about going more to higher income people. And we could start out with, this is equity. All right, but these are some other issues, you know, that need to be addressed. These are other possible sources for fundraising because education and, you know, now technical education is going to continue to grow in importance. Counseling, you know, we've got that low rate of continuing to any kind of training after high school. We're going to have, you know, to assume that we're not, unless we want to fall behind, we're going to need to make some more investments. And so these are other possible sources. We can look at expanding, and we also have the general fund that has the alligator, which we close by level funding things that, and mental health is one that's come back. We're going to have a major issue with developmental disabilities that are aging, their parents are aging out and they have nowhere to go. So we're going to need, and just dump that back on everyone, but we could give some, these are some places we might look, which might be the most we can do right now.
Because I don't want to close the alligator by cutting services.
No, I don't.
No.
And I don't think it needs to be overwhelming.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is some real basics like, you know, like questions. Does it have to all be 6%? I don't think it does, but, you know.
I agree with you. I just think it's something we do after we.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And for me, it takes the pressure off of what we would do first, knowing that there are ways, like we can design a curve and then lower all the rates on the curve with other
We can just deal with
tools.
logistical issues.
Yes.
And not having to worry about the curve because we can deal with that later
Yeah.
to a certain degree.
One thing that I want us potentially not to lose sight of is in terms of the goals or whatever, was being able to tie people's voting decisions to the skin in the game argument. And I think we're sort of drifting away from that. And I understand why, because if we sort of keep it within the tax systems that we already use, we don't necessarily solve that as well. But anyway, I just want to have that be kept in the back of our minds.
And I just want to clarify, Peter, do you think that right now we have a system where people have clarity on that?
I think right now we have a system where there's not as much skin in the game as people would like to see when it comes to people voting on their school budgets because of the income sensitivity. And, and I know we talked last meeting about perhaps moving the scale of income sensitivity even greater. And I guess I just want to make sure that we're thinking about whether or not that affects that issue in a positive or a negative way.
And I just want to, so the circuit breaker certainly removes people's experience of, but I think that, if someone's paying on income, they still see their tax rates go up or down depending on district spending.
Right.
I think it's just that I think the dual system keeps people from clarity of what they're actually voting on.
Right. Theoretically, I agree with you, but I think in practice,
yes,
people know they are sort of more protected from an increase in their income sensitivity rate than they are from their property tax rate.
There's 70,000 renters. That, I don't know. Why wouldn't they say yes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So first we can look at it.
It's going to impact the rent in 2 years.
And it might be helpful, once we decide what we're going to do, then we can decide if this is what we're going to do, how do renters figure in? And it might be helpful to have the tax department, because we put it off, and I think it went into effect this year, but the whole was really more of a rent subsidy than an actual tax.
There it is.
And talk about that and how it does or does not interlace with the property tax system.
Yeah, I'm not walking out of these 6 meetings without having really gotten clear on what a solution is for renters. I think that's like, for me, the most looming unresolved issue of a lot of these past conversations.
But I don't know that we can do that until we decide what it is.
Agreed.
And then, and then we'll do it.
Okay, let's break. Does that work for everyone? Okay, and we'll be back here at 1:15.
1:30.
We can move it up.
12:30 to
You
1:30.
want to move it up?
Yeah.
Do you?
Move it up.
I'd like to move it up. Is that okay with everyone if we move it up, or does everyone want that extra?
All right, you got
So moving it up, okay?
Fine with me.
Hour lunch.
I don't know
Great.
where presenters are looking at. Who have we got in the afternoon?
Well, we could even just spend the first 15 minutes talking about whatever we thought about over lunch.